I thought I was signing up for one night, not a lifetime. The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it knew something I didn't, like it was warning me in a language I wasn't ready to understand. But I signed anyway because rent was due in 3 days. Because my bank account read $42.17. Because desperation has a way of making bad decisions look like opportunities. And when the man across from me slid the contract forward, his cufflinks catching the soft gold light of the private office, I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't read the fine print. Twice, I just focused on the number at the bottom and the way it could fix everything, even if just for a little while, and that was my first mistake, because Adrian Voss didn't look like a man who dealt in little while. He looked like permanence. Like decisions that didn't get undone, his presence filling the room in a way that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe, like my lungs had to adjust to him before they could function again, and when I finally looked up, really looked at him, I understood why people lowered their voices when they spoke his name. Tall, sharp, controlled, every movement deliberate, like he had already calculated every possible outcome and chosen the one that benefited him most. His gaze steady on me. Not curious, not kind, just certain, and that certainty made something in my chest tighten. "You understand the terms," he said, his voice low, even, not a question, and I nodded because it was easier than admitting I didn't fully understand anything. Except the money, except the promise that one night of pretending could solve problems that had been chasing me for months. "It's just a date," I said, forcing a small laugh that sounded too thin in the quiet room. "One night, I play the part, and then we both walk away." And for a second, just a second, something shifted in his expression, not amusement, not disagreement, just something unreadable that made my fingers curl slightly against the table, like my instincts were trying to pull me back before it was too late. But he didn't correct me, didn't argue. He simply watched as I signed my name, slow, deliberate, each letter locking me into something I still believed I could control, and when I pushed the paper back toward him, he glanced down at it, then back at me, and there was a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to make my heartbeat feel too loud in my own ears. "Good," he said finally, and the words settled heavier than it should have. Like it carried more weight than approval, like it meant something I hadn't agreed to out loud. And then he stood, smooth, effortless, adjusting his jacket with a precision that made everything about him feel calculated. "We leave in 10 minutes, he added, already turning away as if the decision had never been mine to begin with, and I sat there for a moment, staring at my signature at the bottom of the page, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. That quiet, persistent thought that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't just agreed to a fake date. I had stepped into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from, because when Adrian Voss made agreements, they didn't end, they evolved, and I had the sinking feeling that this one had already started changing the moment I signed my name. I should have walked away the moment I saw the car, but curiosity has always been louder than instinct, and 10 minutes later I found myself standing on the curb outside a black SUV so polished it reflected the city lights like a mirror. The engine already running, quiet but powerful, like everything about him, and when the driver stepped out to open the back door, I hesitated just long enough to feel it, that flicker of doubt tightening in my chest, but then I remembered the number on that contract, the overdue bills sitting on my kitchen counter, the way my landlord's voice had sounded on the phone that morning, and I got in, because survival does not leave room for hesitation. Not when you are down to your last $40 and hope feels like a luxury you can no longer afford, the door closing behind me with a soft, final click that sounded louder than it should have, like something sealing shut, and when I looked up, Adrian was already there, sitting across from me, one arm resting casually against the leather seat, his posture relaxed in a way that somehow felt more controlled than tense, like he did not need to try to dominate his space. It just happened naturally, his eyes lifting from his phone to meet mine, steady, assessing, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. "Seatbelt," he said, his tone even, not unkind, but not optional either. And I obeyed before I even realized I was moving, the click of the belt snapping into place echoing in the quiet interior, and then the car pulled away from the curb, smooth, effortless, like the world outside was something distant and unimportant, buildings sliding past in blurred streaks of light as the city shifted from familiar streets to something else entirely, something quieter, more exclusive, and I pressed my hands together in my lap to keep them from fidgeting, because suddenly I was aware of everything. The way the leather seat felt too soft beneath me, the faint scent of cologne in the air, the steady rhythm of the engine, and the silence, the kind of silence that was not empty but full, like it was waiting for something to happen. "You seem nervous," he said after a moment, not looking at me this time, his gaze directed out the window as if the observation required no confirmation. "I am not," I replied too quickly, and that was answer enough, because the corner of his mouth shifted just slightly. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, and I hated that he could read me so easily, that he could see through the version of myself I was trying to present, the confident, unbothered girl who had agreed to a simple job. "You should be," he added, and this time he did look at me, and there it was again, that feeling, like the air had changed, like the rules I thought I understood no longer applied, my fingers tightening together as I forced a small laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "It is just a date," I said, repeating the words more for myself than for him, but he did not respond right away, just watched me, studied me in that quiet, unsettling way that made it feel like he was seeing things I had not said out loud. And then he leaned back slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make the words feel heavier when they landed. "Nothing about this is just anything," he said, and I felt it, that shift again, that subtle change in the air that made my heartbeat pick up just a little faster, because something in his tone told me that whatever I thought I had agreed to, whatever version of control I believed I still had, was already slipping, piece by piece. And the worst part was I did not know when it started, only that it had, and I was already inside it. The car slowed before I was ready for it, the smooth motion shifting just enough to pull me out of my thoughts, and when I looked up, the city had changed again, taller buildings, cleaner streets. The kind of place where people did not check their bank accounts before ordering dinner, where everything looked polished and intentional, and then we stopped, the engine going quiet in a way that made the silence feel louder, heavier. And I realized we had arrived somewhere I did not belong, a hotel I had only ever seen in passing, all glass and marble and quiet confidence, the kind of place that did not need to prove anything because it already knew its value, and for a second I did not move. My hand resting lightly against the door handle as doubt pressed in again, sharper this time, because this was no longer an idea or a signature on paper. This was real, and when the door opened from the outside, the driver stepping back to give me space, I had no choice but to step out my shoes, hitting the pavement with a soft sound that felt too small for a place like this, and before I could adjust, before I could fully take it in, Adrian was beside me, his presence immediate, grounding and overwhelming all at once. His hand finding the small of my back not in a way that asked, but in a way that guided, steady, controlled, like he had done this 1,000 times before, and I followed because it felt easier than resisting, because resisting felt pointless in a world that already seemed to move according to his rules, the doors opening as we approached, staff greeting him with quiet respect, not curiosity, not surprise, just recognition, like he was expected, like he always was, and I felt it then. That shift in how people looked at me, not as myself, but as something connected to him, something defined by his presence. And it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because this was supposed to be pretend, but nothing about it felt pretend anymore. Not the way his hand lingered just a second longer than necessary. Not the way his gaze flicked toward me every time someone addressed him, as if he was measuring my reactions, cataloging them, learning me piece by piece, and when we stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft chime that cut us off from the rest of the world, the quiet became something else entirely, something closer, more focused, and I became aware of everything again, the subtle rise and fall of his breathing, the faint reflection of us in the mirrored walls, the way we looked together, like something already established, something that made sense to anyone watching, and I hated how convincing it was, how easy it would be for someone to believe this was real, "Relax," he said, his voice softer now, but no less certain, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders lowering just slightly. "You are doing fine," he added, and for a moment I almost believed him, almost believed that this was just a role I was playing, that I could step out of it at the end of the night and go back to my small apartment and my unpaid bills and my normal life. But then the elevator slowed, the soft ding signaling our arrival, and when the doors opened, revealing a private floor that looked nothing like the rest of the building, quieter, more controlled, like it existed outside of everything else, that feeling returned, stronger now, heavier, settling somewhere deep in my chest, because I understood something I had not wanted to admit before, something I could not ignore anymore. This was never just a date, and whatever part one had agreed to play, it was already becoming something else, something I was not sure I knew how to walk away from, and when his hand brushed mine as we stepped forward, deliberate, grounding, I felt it. Again, that quiet, dangerous certainty in the way he moved, in the way he looked at me, like he already knew the ending to a story I had just begun, and I was the only one who had not caught up yet. The hallway was too quiet, the kind of quiet that did not come from emptiness, but from control, like every sound had been filtered out on purpose, and as we stepped forward, my heels echoing softly against the polished floor, I became painfully aware of how out of place I was, like I had wandered into a world that had rules I did not understand and expectations I had not agreed to meet, but Adrian moved through it like he owned it. Like every step he took had already been decided long before we arrived. His hand brushing lightly against my lower back again, guiding without force, and I followed, because stopping would have drawn attention I did not want, because walking away felt impossible in a space that already seemed designed to keep me exactly where I was. And when we reached the doors at the end of the corridor, they opened before we even touched them, revealing a private event that felt more like a statement than a gathering, low lighting, soft music, conversations held in careful tones. People dressed in ways that suggested power rather than wealth, and every single one of them seemed to notice him the moment he entered, not openly, not rudely, but in subtle shifts, conversations pausing just slightly, eyes lifting, recognition settling in. And then something else happened that I was not prepared for. Those same eyes moved to me, assessing, curious, calculating, and I felt it like a physical weight, the realization that I was no longer invisible, that standing next to him had made me something worth noticing, something worth questioning, and my instinct was to step back, to create space, to remind myself and everyone else that this was temporary, that I did not belong here. But before I could move, his hand closed around mine, firm, steady, not tight but not optional either, and my breath caught, my fingers instinctively tensing before settling against his, because pulling away would have made a scene, and I understood now that scenes were not something he allowed. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low enough that only I could hear, and there it was again, that tone that sounded like a suggestion, but felt like a rule, and I nodded slightly, not trusting my voice. Not trusting myself to say anything that would not reveal how completely out of my depth I was. And then we were moving again, deeper into the room, people greeting him with measured respect, brief handshakes, quiet exchanges, names I did not recognize, but that clearly mattered, and every time someone looked at me, there was a question in their eyes that I did not know how to answer, because I did not know what I was to him, not really, not beyond the words written on that contract. And yet the way he held my hand, the way he positioned me at his side, the way his thumb brushed once lightly across my knuckles as someone approached us, it all felt too natural, too practiced, like this was not new to him, like I was simply stepping into a role someone else had once filled. And the thought sent a sharp flicker of something through my chest that I could not quite name, something between discomfort and something else I refused to examine too closely, and then he stopped, turning slightly toward me, his gaze lowering just enough to meet mine. And for a moment everything else faded, the room, the people, the noise, leaving just the two of us standing in a space that suddenly felt too small. "Remember what you signed," he said quietly, and the words settled over me in a way that made my heartbeat stumble, not because of what he said, but because of how certain he sounded, like there was no version of this night where I walked away unchanged, like the moment I picked up that pen had already decided something I was only just beginning to understand, and when he looked away again, pulling me gently forward to meet the next person waiting to greet him, I realized something that made my stomach tighten just slightly. This was not about pretending anymore, not for him, and maybe, just maybe, it never had been. It happened so quietly that at first I thought I imagined it, the shift in the room, the subtle way conversations softened as someone new approached, and I followed Adrian's gaze just in time to see a man step into our path, older, composed. The kind of presence that did not demand attention but received it anyway, his eyes sharp as they landed on Adrian first, then moved to me with a flicker of curiosity that lingered just a second too long. "Boss," he greeted, his voice smooth, practiced, and Adrian nodded once, controlled, acknowledging without yielding. "Harrison," he replied, nothing more, no warmth, no pretense, just recognition between two people who clearly understood more than they said out loud. And I felt Adrian's grip on my hand shift slightly, not tighter, just more present, like a reminder, like a statement, and Harrison noticed, of course he did, his gaze dropping briefly to where our hands were joined before lifting again, a faint smile touching his lips. "I see you have made a new arrangement," he said, the words polite but edged with something I could not quite place, and my stomach tightened because I did not know what I was supposed to be in this conversation. Not really. Not beyond standing here and not saying the wrong thing, but Adrian answered before I could even consider it. "She is with me," he said simply, and there it was again, that tone, that quiet finality that did not invite further questions. But Harrison was not the kind of man who stopped at simple answers. I could see that immediately in the way his expression shifted, interest sharpening just slightly. For tonight, he pressed lightly, and the question hung there, subtle but undeniable, and I felt it. That moment where everything could still be explained away, where I could still laugh it off and say yes, just tonight, just a job, just a contract that meant nothing beyond a few hours and a paycheck. But Adrian did not hesitate, not even for a second, his thumb brushing once against my hand in a motion that felt almost absent-minded, but carried something deeper beneath it. "No," he said, and the word landed heavier than anything else in the room. "She signed." He continued, his gaze steady, unshaken. "She stays," and I felt it then, not just heard it, not just understood the words, but felt them settle somewhere deep inside me, heavy, unmovable, like something locking into place that I had not realized was still open. And Harrison's smile widened just slightly, not surprised, not shocked, just entertained in a quiet, knowing way that made my pulse quicken. "Of course she did," he murmured, his eyes flicking back to me, assessing in a way that made me feel seen and exposed at the same time. Like he was trying to figure out what kind of person would agree to something like that, what kind of person would stand here and not immediately walk away. And I wanted to say something, to correct it, to explain that it was not like that, that I had not known, that this was supposed to be simple, temporary, controlled. But the words stayed stuck somewhere behind my ribs because the way Adrian stood beside me, the way his presence pressed in without touching, made it feel like speaking out of turn would shift something I did not yet understand, and instead, I stayed silent. My fingers still wrapped in his, my heartbeat just a little too fast, my thoughts just a little too loud, because in that moment, surrounded by people who spoke in half-truths and quiet power, I realized something that made everything else fall away. This was not a misunderstanding, this was not a miscommunication, this was exactly what he intended, and the contract I had signed was never meant to end at midnight, it was meant to begin there. The rest of the night blurred in a way that felt too controlled to be accidental, like every interaction had been measured, every conversation placed exactly where it needed to be, and I stayed at his side because I did not know where else to go. Because every time I considered stepping away, his presence pulled me back without effort, without force, just a quiet gravity that made leaving feel like the wrong move, and I hated how natural it began to feel, how my steps started to match his pace, How my responses became smoother, more automatic, like I was learning a role I never auditioned for, and somewhere between introductions and polite smiles, I stopped thinking about the contract as something distant and started feeling it as something real. Something active, something unfolding around me whether I agreed with it or not, and when the music softened and the room shifted into something slower, more relaxed, Adrian's hand moved again, this time not just guiding but turning me slightly toward him, his fingers settling at my waist in a way that was firm but not possessive, controlled but unmistakable, and my breath caught for a second before I steadied it, reminding myself that this was still part of the arrangement. Still something I could define if I held onto the right boundaries. "You are doing well," he said. Quietly, his voice close enough that it felt like it belonged only to me, and I nodded, because it was easier than admitting that I no longer knew what "well" meant in this context. Easier than admitting that I was starting to lose track of where the performance ended and something else began, and as we moved across the floor, slow, deliberate, the space around us seemed to shift again, people giving way without being asked, conversations adjusting without interruption, and I realized that being near him did not just change how I was seen, it changed how the world reacted, how it moved, how it made room, and that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and undeniable, because it meant this was not temporary for him. This was not a game he stepped in and out of. This was his reality, and I had just stepped into it without understanding the cost, and when the music ended and his hand lingered just a second longer than necessary before releasing me, I felt the absence. Immediately, like something I had not agreed to miss was already gone, and that unsettled me more than anything else that night, because it meant I was already adapting, already responding in ways I did not fully control, and when I took a small step back, putting just enough space between us to remind myself that I still had that choice, his gaze followed me, steady, unreadable, but there was something there now, something new, something that felt less like observation and more like expectation. "Do not drift too far," he said, not sharply, not coldly, just simply, like a fact, like something that had already been decided, and I forced a small smile, nodding again because it was easier. Because arguing in a room like this felt like speaking the wrong language in the wrong place, but inside, something shifted, something quieter but stronger, a question I could not ignore anymore, not about him, not about the contract, but about myself. About why I was still here, why I had not walked out the moment I realized what this really was, and the answer came before I could stop it, quiet and uncomfortable and far too honest, because part of me wanted to see where this went, part of me wanted to understand him, and that was the most dangerous realization of all, because it meant this was no longer just something happening to me, it was something I was choosing to stay in. The moment I stepped away from him, I felt it, the shift, subtle but immediate, like the room exhaled in a different rhythm when I was no longer anchored to his side. Conversations resumed without that quiet tension threading through them. And for the first time all night, I could hear my own thoughts clearly again, too clearly, because they all seemed to be asking the same question, "What am I doing here?" And I moved toward the edge of the room, slower now, more aware of every step, my heels pressing softly against the floor as I created distance that felt both relieving and wrong at the same time, like I had stepped out of something unfinished, and I told myself I needed air, needed space, needed a moment where I was just Lena again and not whatever version of myself existed next to Adrian Voss, and when I reached the balcony doors, I pushed them open, the cool night air brushing against my skin like a quiet reset, the city stretching out below in a sea of lights that suddenly felt familiar, grounding, real, and I leaned lightly against the railing, exhaling slowly as I tried to piece everything back together, the contract, the words, the way he had said she stays, like it was already decided. Like my agreement had been a formality rather than a choice, and I shook my head slightly, pressing my fingers against my temple as if I could physically push the confusion away, because this was not what I signed up for. This was not what I agreed to. And I needed to remind myself of that before I got pulled any deeper into something I did not understand. "You look like you are reconsidering," a voice said behind me, smooth, unfamiliar, and I turned to find Harrison stepping onto the balcony, his expression calm, almost amused, like he had been expecting to find me here. "I am just getting some air," I replied, my tone steadier than I felt, and he nodded slightly, moving to stand beside me but not too close, respectful in a way that felt intentional. "That is usually how it starts," he said, glancing out over the city. "A little distance, a little clarity. Just enough to realize you have stepped into something you cannot define yet," and my fingers tightened slightly against the railing, because there was something in the way he said it that felt less like observation and more like experience. "It is just a contract," I said, the words sounding weaker now, less convincing than they had even an hour ago, and he let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, more like acknowledgement. "If it were just a contract," he replied, finally, looking at me, his gaze sharp but not unkind, "you would not still be here," and the truth in that settled uncomfortably in my chest, because he was right. I could have left, I should have left, and yet I had not, and I did not have a clean answer for why. "He does not do temporary," Harrison continued after a moment, his voice lower now, more serious. "Everything about him is built on permanence, on control, on knowing exactly what he wants before anyone else even realizes they have been chosen." And I swallowed, my pulse quickening just slightly, because there it was again, that word, chosen, and I did not know if it was supposed to feel like a warning or something else entirely. "I was not chosen," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I agreed to a job," and Harrison studied me for a long second before nodding once, slow, deliberate. "That is what you think," he said, and before I could respond, before I could argue or ask what he meant, I felt it, that familiar presence behind me, not touching, not speaking, just there, but somehow more commanding than anything else in the room, and I did not need to turn to know it was him, did not need to look to feel the shift in the air, the way everything seemed to realign the moment he stepped close. "You should not wander," Adrian's voice came, calm, steady, and my breath caught slightly as I turned, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, standing between the quiet honesty of the balcony and the controlled gravity of the man in front of me, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else had all night. Leaving was still an option, but staying was starting to feel like a decision. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet stretching between us like something fragile that could break if I moved too quickly, and I became aware of everything again, the cool night air against my skin, the distant hum of the city below, the steady, controlled presence of Adrian standing just close enough to remind me that distance was temporary, not permanent, and I straightened slightly, forcing myself to meet his gaze instead of avoiding it, because something inside me had shifted. Something that refused to stay silent any longer. "I needed a minute," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, and he studied me for a second, not interrupting, not dismissing, just observing in that way that made it feel like he was measuring more than my words. Like he was weighing my reaction against something only he understood, and now, he asked, simple, direct, and I hesitated, because I did not have a clean answer, not one that fit into the version of this night I had originally agreed to. Not one that made sense if this was still just a job. "Now I am trying to understand what exactly I signed," I admitted, and there it was, the truth, out loud, heavier than I expected, and for the first time since I met him, something in his expression shifted in a way that felt almost like approval, not warm, not soft, but real. "You are starting to ask the right question," he said, his voice low, steady, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant there was an answer I had not yet reached, something waiting just beyond what I could currently see, and I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive but grounding, holding on to something that still felt like mine. "You said it was a date," I continued, my gaze steady now, refusing to look away. "One night, that is what I agreed to," and he nodded once. Not denying it, not correcting it, which only made the tension in my chest tighten further. "And yet you signed a contract without limits," he replied, and my breath caught slightly, because I remembered it then, not clearly, not fully, but enough. The language that had felt too formal, too complicated, the sections I had skimmed because I thought they were standard, irrelevant, temporary, That was not what you told me, I said, quieter now, but sharper. And for a moment the air shifted. Again, not heavier, not dangerous, just more focused, like we had stepped into a space where the truth mattered more than the performance. I told you enough, he said, not coldly, not dismissively, just simply. Like it was a fact that did not require justification, and I felt frustration rise, quick and unexpected, because I did not like that answer, did not like how easily he said it, how calmly he stood there as if everything was already decided. That is not the same thing, I replied, and for a second, just a second, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not irritation, something closer to interest, like he had been waiting to see if I would push back, and instead of shutting it down, instead of correcting me, he stepped closer. Not invading, not forcing, just closing the distance enough that I could feel the shift, the way the space between us changed, the way my focus narrowed without permission. You are still here, he said quietly, and the words landed deeper than anything else he had said, because they were not a command, not a rule, just an observation, and I realized then that he was right. I was still here, not because I had to be, not because I was being forced, but because I had not left. Because something in me had chosen to stay even when I started to understand what that meant, and that realization settled heavily in my chest, more complicated than fear, more dangerous than certainty, and when he extended his hand slightly, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering in that same controlled, deliberate way, I hesitated for half a second before placing my hand in his again, because walking away was still possible, but staying was starting to feel like something else entirely. Something I had not planned for, something I had not agreed to, and yet something I was no longer sure I wanted to escape from. His hand was warm against mine, steady, certain, like he already knew I would take it before I did, and as our fingers settled together again, I felt it, that quiet shift inside me, not sudden, not overwhelming, just a slow, undeniable change that made everything feel different from the moment I had stepped onto that balcony, and when he led me back inside, the room did not feel as foreign as it had before, the noise softer, the movement easier to follow, like I had already begun adjusting to a world I had not planned to enter, and that realization should have scared me more than it did, but instead it settled somewhere deeper, heavier. Something I could not ignore anymore, because this was no longer just about him, it was about me, about the fact that I was still walking beside him without resistance, still matching his pace, still letting his presence guide me through a space that once felt impossible to navigate. And when people looked at us now, I noticed it differently, not just the curiosity, not just the quiet recognition, but something else, something closer to acceptance. Like they had already decided what I was to him, and were simply waiting for me to understand it too, and that thought lingered as we moved through the room one last time, conversations wrapping up, glasses set aside, the night shifting toward its quiet conclusion. And when we finally stepped away from the crowd, the tension that had followed us all evening seemed to dissolve just slightly, leaving something calmer in its place, something more controlled, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing in a way they had not all night. Because for the first time since I signed that contract, I was not reacting, I was choosing, and that difference mattered more than anything else, even if I did not fully understand what it meant yet. "We are leaving," Adrian said, his voice low, steady, and I nodded without hesitation, because the idea of staying longer felt unnecessary, like everything that needed to happen tonight had already happened, and as we walked back through the hallway, the quiet surrounding us once again, I glanced down briefly at our hands. Still linked, still steady, and I realized I was no longer thinking about pulling away, no longer calculating distance or escape, and that thought should have alarmed me, but it did not the way it would have just a few hours ago. Because something had shifted, something I could not undo, and when we reached the elevator, the doors sliding open with that same soft chime, I stepped inside without waiting, without questioning, and he followed, the space closing around us once more. But this time it felt different, less suffocating, more defined, like I understood the boundaries even If I did not agree with all of them yet, and as the elevator began its descent, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, studying the version of myself standing there, composed, steady, different, and I realized I did not look like someone trapped. I looked like someone who had made a decision, even if I had not said it out loud yet, and when I finally turned my gaze back to him, meeting those steady, unreadable eyes, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep in my chest. Quiet, but absolute. I had not just agreed to a contract. I had stepped into something that was already shaping me, already changing the way I saw the world and myself inside it. And as the elevator doors opened, the city waiting beyond like it always had, I knew one thing for certain. I could still walk away. I could still choose a different path. But for the first time since this began, I was not sure I wanted to, because somewhere between the signature and this moment, the line between obligation and choice had blurred, and I was the one who had let it happen.